All right, so we got a new report here from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, which typically functions essentially as a weapon for economic imperialists, but they put together a good report here on climate change and exactly how much the fossil fuel industry continues to be subsidized to the tune of trillions of dollars a year that are essentially propping up an industry that is doing absolutely nothing but further exacerbating the inevitable consequences that are going to come as a result of inaction on climate change. And specifically, they get into a lot of the good details here in terms of how we discuss this conversation of how much it's going to cost to invest in climate change right now, invest in infrastructure, invest in combating climate change right now versus how much it's going to cost if we do basically nothing. So let's get into some of the details here, and then we'll point out some of the massive hypocrisy that is going on in modern domestic U.S. policy. So fossil fuel industry gets subsidies of $11 million per minute. $11 million per minute. The IMF finds. So trillions of dollars a year are, quote, adding fuel to the fire of the climate crisis, experts say. So here's some of the details. The fossil fuel industry benefits from subsidies of $11 million every minute, according to an analysis by the International Monetary Fund, and the IMF found the production and burning of coal, oil, and gas was subsidized by $5.9 trillion in just 2020. $5.9 trillion. Again, keep this in perspective as we are currently in the United States negotiating a $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill that only adds, a couple $100 billion investing in specific climate related portions of that, and that is going to be extrapolated over 10 years. So $6 trillion being subsidizing the fossil fuel industry in 2020, and meanwhile we are debating whether or not we should be spending, $50 billion a year or so on investing in climate change here in the United States, the wealthiest country on earth. So just gives you a perspective as to how skewed our priorities currently are. But they continue saying subsidized by $5.9 trillion in 2020, with not a single country pricing all its fuels sufficiently to reflect their full supply and environmental costs. And experts said the subsidies were, quote, adding fuel to the fire of the climate crisis at a time when rapid reductions in carbon emissions were urgently needed. And explicit subsidies that cut fuel prices accounted for 8% of the total, and tax breaks another 6%. And then we get more to the meat of this here. So the biggest factors that they calculated were failing to make polluters pay for the deaths and poor health caused by air pollution, which accounted for 42% of this number, and for the heat waves and other impacts of global heating. So as you can see from this chart right here, basically they have the explicit and the implicit costs that are associated with how we are currently subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. And if you see, implicit is a hell of a lot more than even explicit, which means basically a large portion of this is we're simply losing trillions of dollars a year because all of our governments across the world, specifically China, the United States, and a couple others that they call out in this piece, are completely refusing to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable. And one thing that comes to mind is the recent Stephen Donziger case. Okay, I covered this in a previous video that I'll put down in the description if you want to go and watch it. But basically, Stephen Donziger was a human rights lawyer, or is a human rights lawyer, who is currently about to face 6 months in federal prison because he successfully brought a case against Chevron for completely obliterating a portion of the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador that is the size of Rhode Island. And he won a court case against Chevron in Ecuador on behalf of the indigenous people in Ecuador. And Chevron was supposed to pay out nearly $10 billion to go clean up the mess that they had created. And instead of actually paying that $10 billion that were owed to those indigenous people in Ecuador, what did they do? They turned around and created a massive legal campaign against Stephen Donziger, the human rights lawyer, and they have successfully managed to essentially get him convicted for a tiny minor charge that he has been in house arrest for about a year or 2 years now, and will be facing 6 months in a federal prison on top of that. So it just gives you, again, the perspective of where our priorities are here in the United States as a country. Okay, our legal system is currently protecting Chevron and other gigantic fossil fuel companies and punishing the actual lawyers who are bringing successful cases against them. It's just absolutely backwards and absolutely ridiculous priorities. But a little bit more of the details they say here. Setting fossil fuel prices that reflect their true cost would cut global CO2 emissions by over a third, the IMF analysis said, and this would be a big step towards meeting the internationally agreed 1.5 degrees Celsius target, which is seemingly more and more completely out of reach. Really we're more trying to hit that 2 degrees Celsius, preventing that 2 degrees Celsius from happening. But they continue saying keeping this target within reach is a key goal of the UN COP26 climate summit in November, which is about to be coming up. And they point out also here, importantly, a couple of the countries that are mostly responsible for this, but also the International Energy Agency, the IEA, said in May that the development of new oil and gas fields must stop this year to meet climate goals. So must stop this year, as we currently have a president who is going around pretending like he cares and actually believes in climate change and acting on it. And meanwhile, the Biden administration is to resume drilling auctions in a setback for the climate agenda. So Joe Biden completely ignoring what the IMF is saying. Joe Biden completely ignoring what that other recent IPCC report that came out is saying, which is that we need to completely be halting these subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. We need to be completely halting all of these new drilling and oil ventures that we are setting out to be doing. And Biden is leading us exactly in the opposite direction against the advice of the actual experts. And again, just to give you a perspective on who is actually the majority responsible for this. So the comprehensive IMF report found that prices were at least 50% below their true cost for 99% of coal, 52% of diesel, and 47% of natural gas in 2020, and 5 countries were responsible for 2/3 of the subsidies, and that would be China, the US, Russia, India, and Japan. And without action, subsidies will rise to 6.4 trillion by 2025. So basically, I mean, what is the overall point here? Well, again, listen, domestically, here in the United States, we currently have the opportunity to act on climate change. We currently have the opportunity through this $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill. Even though it doesn't go nearly far enough on climate change, we still have the ability to do something, take that first step towards addressing climate change and starting to invest in renewable energies in a more substantial way and cutting back on some of the fossil fuel subsidies. So we have an opportunity to do that right now. Unfortunately for us, motherfuckers like Joe Manchin are currently being allowed to basically set the standards for what this bill is going to inevitably look like. And guess what? Their priorities are in a completely wrong place. So Joe Manchin says Bernie Sanders wants entitlement society as West Virginia lawmaker holds up popular Democratic spending bill. Well, I wonder if these entitlements would also include things like this. Manchin bailed out plant that pays millions to his family's coal company. So listen, these people who are coming out and currently trying to tank the $3.5 trillion bill, which again, we should be pushing for something like a Green New Deal, a full-scale Green New Deal, if we were going to be serious about tackling climate change. But the $3.5 trillion bill is that initial first step that would be somewhat good, right? That's something that we can and should be doing right now in the immediate sense. And yet, we still have coal barons, millionaire coal barons who make $500,000 a year from their coal companies like Joe Manchin, who are trying to block portions of this $3.5 trillion bill, specifically, believe it or not, the climate portions of this bill. And I wonder if there's a conflict of interest there that maybe should be pointed out more often. So listen, the overall lesson of this is exactly what the overall lesson of all of these climate discussions have been for a long time. We need to be aggressively investing in renewable energy and moving away from fossil fuels as quickly and aggressively as humanly possible. And you see here, it's not even like you can make the economic argument and say, oh, well, you know, renewable energies, they're just not economically feasible yet, right? It's just not cost efficient yet. And then you turn around and you look at the actual data and look, they're spending nearly $6 trillion a year propping up a fossil fuel industry that is doing nothing but potentially costing us even more down the line by not allowing us to act on climate change in any serious way. So it's the complete opposite of the lines that we are fed constantly by the mainstream media and by these fossil fuel lobbyists and the politicians that they control. It's the complete opposite, right? It's not that investing in renewable energy and targeting the fossil fuel industry is going to hurt the country economically. It's the exact opposite of that. It's that if we don't invest in climate change right now, if we don't invest in getting rid of fossil fuel and investing in renewable energy, if we don't invest in climate infrastructure and resiliency, then it's going to cost us more down the line. Okay, so we need as much as humanly possible of an investment right now in climate change. And meanwhile, we have all of this data that is coming out that is showing us exactly that we are heading in the wrong direction. 2020, $6 trillion propping up the fossil fuel industry. It's absolutely a joke.